Hello folks, my name is Roberto Robert. I'm a concept artist here at Hinterland Studio, makers of The Long Dark. I'm going to take you through my process of illustrating uh, in the style of The Long Dark. The Long Dark is a survival game, player against nature, and one of the adversaries that we've added is the moose. And this is a concept painting slash illustration in the style of The Long Dark. And here you can see me just sketching. This is the way I start out, just doing very loose line sketches, and then I tone them. In this case, this is the one that was chosen by the art director and the director. And one of the things I do initially is I have this guide that tells me, gives me the rule of thirds, the halfway point, and then a golden ratio, which in this case I didn't end up using. Here I am just marking it up. I got the dimensions of what the image should be after, so I have to change it. Also, putting this guide on, I noticed that the horizon line was directly in the middle, which is a huge no-no. Yeah, there it is right there. And so I need to change it. I need to do some revisions on it. I did about 12 thumbs. There they are right there. You can see them. I tried to be as diverse in them in their kind of settings. There were some not restrictions, but requests as to what the setting should be. In this case, the moose, obviously. I'll talk about what's going on right now in a minute. There should be birch trees because the moose will be in areas with birch trees in the game, and cattails, which are these plants that grow near bodies of water, which they'll eat. So there'll be indicators of where potentially you might find moose in the game. So once I started reworking the thumbnail based on the issues that I pointed out, which the big one being the horizon is basically at the middle point of the frame, and I added the birch trees, as you can see here. And then what I did is I split up the sketch. I spent a lot of time doing this because what I'm doing here is I use the sketch as the basis for the final as much as possible. One of the hard lessons that I've learned over the years is that the more problems you can solve early, the less problems you'll have later. Think about it as having almost like an assembly line that you're doing. You're starting with your sketch. You're moving on to a thumbnail. You're moving on to a sketch, and then you're moving on to a final. Those are stages, and if you don't solve a problem in the thumbnail stage, you will come across it in the final stage, for example. And just like an assembly line, if you're building a car or something and you're putting a door together in a car, you're welding it together, and you miss a problem early on, there's a bolt out of place or something like that. If you get to the end of the assembly line when there's like upholstery and stuff on the car, like the finishing touches, you have to break everything off to fix that one bolt that's out of place. And this is the same thing that, it's kind of technical to speak that way and maybe unromantic to speak of art like this, but it is really like that. If you don't solve the problems early on in the thumbnail, you're going to have to solve them in the final, and it is a lot harder to solve them in the final. Things may be off balance, and in this case, if I didn't resolve the horizon issue, for example, what would have happened in the final stage? I would have had to move the composition down and then repaint everything at the top. So spend the necessary time early on to avoid those issues. Now moving on to what's happening on the screen here. So as you can see, I showed them really quickly there. I took some screen grabs from the game. Some captures, some high definition, high resolution captures from the game. You can do that with on a Mac function F10 or on a PC, probably Control F10 or yeah. And you can get some really high resolution captures of the game. And what I do is just like photo bashing. I kind of bash the elements of the game into it to kind of keep it in the style. Here you can see I had the concept. I concepted the moose as well. So there's no reason to paint everything from scratch if you don't have to. Again, just like photo bashing, this is a time save and also an effective way use of your time. So I'm not. There should be no reason to avoid doing this unless there's a specific reason to avoid it. In this case, this is a time constraint. So, and it's the moose and the concept was approved, and the 3D model is largely based very closely, if not exactly, what the painting that you see there on the top left of the moose. So I'm just transforming it into place, and I've done that with the environment as well. You know, you can see the trees in the background, and I don't do it with every single element. As you can see, I painted some of them. I color sample from the birch trees, which are these white these white ones, these white trees with these horizontal pieces of bark that are darker on it, and I paint them with a brush sometimes, and it just helps me fill the canvas. Like one of the things, I don't always start paintings with this. Every painting is a different beast, and you have to kind of wrestle with it. And in this case, because the requirements of the painting were that it needed to be by a body of water with cattails, with the birch trees. There's any number of ways you can solve this problem. So what I did is I made a bunch of thumbnails, and it's easier obviously to do them in black and white, and then from there I moved on to getting it a sketch, and then now the base is a final. And like I was saying before, I solved all the problems. So because I'm starting in black and white, one of the first things I want to do is just kind of fill up as much as possible of the canvas that is still in black and white with as close to final as possible. And in this case, again, because I'm using the screen grabs, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like photo bashing, but it's kind of like screen grab bashing and then concept bashing, which I've done a bunch with in this game. Whenever I have to illustrate something, if I have a concept already done, I'm just going to put it in and use it as a basis. The brush strokes are already there because that's a big part of the charm of the game is the fact that the style is painterly. So it helps that the concept that I've already painted the concept. I've already spent my time being very careful to try to get those brush strokes. And this beard of the moose that I'm using the selection tool to mark out, it's kind of a funny name. I found out about it when I was initially concepting out the moose. Some people call it the moustache, which is really bizarre, but it's actually called a bell or a dewlap, and nobody knows what it is, but it's a distinctive feature of this the moose. And I just thought that was a funny little thing. I remember finding out, and I was like, that is the most ridiculous name I've ever heard, a moustache. But anyway, I use the selection tool a fair bit. I like it. It allows you to have very sharp edges. So one of the issues I ran into initially, not initially, but when I first started painting digitally, was that I had a hard time controlling. It's easy to get soft edges, but it's hard to get sharp edges. And it wasn't until within the last, I would say 5 years or something, that I started using the selection tool. The selection tool gives you very sharp edges, and you can overdo it on images with it. You want to control it. You want to practice with it. You want to really know how to use it, and I like using it around focal points. And in this case, obviously, the head of the moose is the focal point. Generally the moose. But because it's the other thing it helps with, because the sketch that I refined, the black and white sketch is underneath. I split it up, and then what I believe I did is I increased the size of it to the required dimensions that the image needed to be. So there's a lot of pixelization and just blurriness in the image from increasing. You see it in the trees behind the moose there. You see like that this this very jagged edge on it, and the selection tool allows me to I go over it again and sharpen the edges. One of the things that I like about it the most is that if you get used to working with it, you actually start, and you do a lot of not over painting, but you go over the area multiple times. You kind of, as with any painting, you figure stuff out as you go. So one area like the tail, for example, changes a lot. I'm doing it right there. But if I keep doing new selections with it, it adds a nice kind of charm to it, where you see kind of the colors from below poking through a little bit sometimes, and it gives it a nice, almost painterly charm. And again, with the style of The Long Dark, it is a game that we've strived to make as painterly as possible. And the way that I could sum up the style of what we've tried to achieve with the Long Dark is broad areas of subtle texture encased in sharp and simple silhouettes. And you see me doing this a lot. Like the trees are not realistic at all. They are stylized. You can see the branches are, there's no spindly ones anywhere. Especially if you play the game, you see that there's not many. There's a lot of the silhouettes are quite strong in the game. So part of the style is to achieve to capture that in this image. I spent a bunch of time on the moose, as one should, because it is the focal point. And you can see something I haven't mentioned yet is that I do a fair bit of flipping the canvas horizontally. I have a shortcut set up in Photoshop that I put as a Control Q or function or Command Q, sorry, because I never need to quit the program like that, because that's the default function is to quit the program. I never have to do that, so I have it set up as a shortcut to flip it. And I used to do in college specifically, I used to do a lot of acrylic paintings. And one thing that I learned earlier on, the teacher advised us to do this, I remember, was to hold up a mirror, and look at the painting in a reflection. And it's amazing. I remember being almost shocked when I was doing the self-portrait, I think, in the second year. And I looked at the painting in the mirror after a bunch of hours working on the eyes. And in the mirror, I noticed immediately the eyes were completely incorrect. They were offset, anatomically they were incorrect. One was higher than the other, and I would turn back and look at the portrait again, and it looked fine, and it was a bizarre thing. And so ever since then, I really try to look at flip the image periodically from left to right. For whatever reason, it allows you to see errors in your image. So I'm a big proponent of that. I think everyone should do that. It helps you see the mistakes. It helps you see it with new eyes. It's almost like you're looking at a different artwork or a familiar artwork or something. So yeah, and continuing here with what I'm doing, I'm moving the trees around slightly. I'm refining some silhouettes. And I try to move around the canvas evenly, so that I don't I never become too focused on one specific area. It helps to be mindful of that. I've never found it's just something that I think over time, as you become better artists and your skill grows, you just need to be more and more mindful of that. The other thing that I've spent a long time getting good at, and I'm still not great at it, is not zooming in. You can see here that the painting stays basically that same size in Photoshop. I was really bad at it. I occasionally have days where I'm pretty bad at it too. You want to stay as far away from the painting as possible until you're basically at the detail stage, because the painting works as a whole. It doesn't work as individual pieces. And when you spend too much time zoomed in, you're kind of assembling it like a puzzle, or not a puzzle. You're assembling it in pieces. You need to see the whole thing working. If it works from afar, it'll work from up close. The only thing that's missing up close is detail and sharpness, and that's very easy to accomplish. That's the funnest part, and it's the thing that most artists, I find, struggle with, is doodling and spending too much time in those details, because it's fun, it's easy. If you can break down the painting into different sections, they're easier to manage, and that has its value to do that in some paintings, but not in all of them, and not all the time. So I try to advise any artist, try to stay away from the paint, try to stay a decent distance away from the painting as much as possible. as I mentioned before, I used to do traditional painting in college, and one of the things that I noticed when I started doing things digitally is that when you're doing a painting in real life, like traditional mediums, you're standing up with an easel, and you always have this relationship with the painting where you're kind of at a comfortable distance, you're far away from it. And when you do things digitally, you can, that zoom is killer because you can just zoom in immediately. With the traditional painting, you can't do that right away. People do, and young artists do that, but at least I find it's a lot. It's not as tempting to zoom in or to get up close to a traditional painting as it is to zoom in Photoshop. So again, you've seen I've flipped the canvas a couple times here, and again that same thing, trying to see it with new eyes. I try to dance around the painting. If there's a lot of things to hit, and I remember one teacher when I was in college, and this is unbeknownst to me, I think when I was putting this together, I realized, I kind of still paint like this. Is that he was a huge proponent of try to get the painting done as quickly as possible. At any stage, if you need to abandon the painting, it should look close to done. Now, that's not a hard rule that I follow. It's more of maybe the way you approach the painting. I don't even think he meant it as a hard rule to follow, but it's the way you approach the painting where, and again, coming back to that, don't zoom in, don't doodle. The other part of it is don't focus on one specific area too much, even if you're not zooming in, because again, the painting needs to work as a whole, and it helps if you're kind of balancing everything out as you go evenly, so you can begin to see how things are playing off of each other. Here I am using the Lasso Tool again, my favorite weapon. I really love that thing. It's looking back at the video of this, I've realized, wow, I used it a lot. But here you see me. What I've done is I've traced over the shape of the sketch. Now I've inverted it. I've erased it so you get a sharp edge on it. And now I'm going to start painting over top of it. And I use a fairly decent sized brush. And I'm not really, like here I think what I'm doing is I'm starting to, look, I mask out the ear there. But I start to paint on the lighting and stuff. And then I realize, no, I should just block the whole thing in and broad stroke it to get the shape of it and a nice... the volume of it set. Here I am flipping the canvas horizontally again. And I lost the selection there, but that's okay. What I'm doing here is I'm going to work on the other side. And I've gotten enough practice with this lasso tool that I can draw with it pretty comfortably. It almost feels like a pencil because the line is so sharp, because you're just worrying about line. Even though it's assisting you in generating a volume, it actually functions more as a line tool, and I actually really like line drawing, so it works to my preferences, I think, quite well. One of the advantages of using this method is that you can use quite big brushes and even texture brushes, and you'll see this later on more so. You use big brushes and you use them in a selection that's masked out, so you don't get areas where the edge is drawn in. That's one of the things I really love about it, is that because you can select the edge, you don't have to have a brush stroke defining the edge. And sometimes, not always, but at least in my preference, I like that a little more, that the brush stroke maybe goes beyond the edge of where it needs to be. You see that in the antler on the far side there more, even if it is using the round brush. At this point, what I'm doing there is I'm defining the lighting on it. Because it is the antlers are actually a three-dimensional shape. They curve around. They almost have this bowl shape to them. So there is areas that are more in shadow, obviously, than not. And I have a lot of reference up. That's something I haven't touched on. I have a lot of reference on the antlers. I remember when I did the initial concept. The initial concept up there, I being orthographic, it was hard to get the antlers to read. In a weird way, it was a lot easier to define the antlers in perspective. And because they're such a three-dimensional shape, I needed a lot of reference. I've seen people artists say, reference is cheating and things like that. And I do not subscribe to that line of thinking. I think reference is important. You don't know if you shouldn't struggle on how to draw something if you don't have to. And those are self-imposed limitations you're giving yourself. I think once I heard it described by one of the, I think the massive black artist, with Bianca, I think is his name. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. He gave this great example. He was doing this painting, and he said, if you want to draw a bike, bikes are pretty ubiquitous in a lot of places. Try drawing it without reference, and you'd be surprised what errors you have that are very obvious. As soon as you start drawing, I remember trying this, just even though I did not need convincing on using ref, I remember trying this, and I was like, oh yeah, this is actually quite difficult. I don't know the structure of it. Why spend time struggling with something if you don't need to? Time is a precious resource. You should use reference when possible. The thing that helps not using reference and maybe speeds you up, because if you have to look for reference for every little thing, that is a slow process indeed. Doing studies, though, helps you understand things in your head. I think I've seen people who don't use reference, and I don't think that they have some philosophical thing against it. What it is that they actually know what things look like because they've spent time observing them and studying them. And you want to build a visual dictionary in your head. That's always a good idea. A lot of people do this with figures, humans, because they're easy, obviously, because we see them every day, and a lot of people like doing characters. So the more you spend time with humans, you know exactly how many, the anatomy works without having to constantly look at reference, because you've spent time studying it, so you know how things look. And that is the advantage of having getting references, that the more that reference helps you understand a subject, the less you'll need it eventually. So something that I do remember at this point in the painting was that the eye was just, I couldn't get it to look right. I was not happy with it, so I moved on to other parts of the moose. In this case, the front nose snout there, because it is quite definite. Quite a unique feature of this animal. Moose from afar, you can kind of tell that it's not a reindeer or a caribou. Reindeer and caribou are the same animal, by the way, and or another animal, because of the snout that it has. It's a very unique part of the face of the moose. Here I am trying to get that eye again. I think at some point I'm like, okay, I got to leave it alone for now. I can't. I'm not finding the solution right now. I should move on to other areas. And I think what I'm doing here is I'm softening edges as well. I'm using a round brush a lot, just to draw out. There's no reason, at least I don't. Sometimes I use a texture brush in this case to draw things out, but I find that the round brush actually does quite a good job. You don't have to worry about the texture. You don't have to worry about what edge you have. Especially if you have a texture brush that is not it's not circular. Depending on the edge you're drawing with, it's going to give you a different result. The round brush is good for sketching and for kind of blocking things out, I find. But I have other brushes that I use here. I am using one to define this beard of the moustache. Again, it's more for breaking things up as well. I find that I don't want to force myself to use one specific tool all the time. I think sometimes what happens is that I start using another brush, and then it almost creates momentum. I can't explain exactly why, but I find that it does create momentum. I get stuck on something, I don't know exactly how to do it. I get another brush, I start painting with it, and then suddenly I find myself a couple of minutes later, it's like, oh, I'm beginning to make progress on this. I don't know why that is, but I suggest that you try it yourself. If you ever feel like you're you're noodling, you're keeping yourself busy, but you're not actually moving forward on a painting, which happens, I think, to everybody. Is it just switch a brush and see if that helps. If you switch mediums. This is a brush. This one here I'm using is one that I made for the long dark. It's a texture brush that I use a lot. It gives it a unique look, and in this case, I'm trying to get the impression of the snow on the feet of the moose here. Part of the style of the long dark is not only a painterly style, but I also had some brushes that I made, and it helped define the look of the game. If I'm using a set of brushes, I think a lot of the artists, both the 3D artists as well, do that when they're most of the textures in the game are handcrafted, if not based on something real. Oh, what I'm doing here is I realize that it's too muted, the painting, so I do a quick hue and saturation pass on it, and what I'm doing, it's very quick, but what I do is I duplicate that hue and saturation layer, and I pin it to each layer that I'm using below. So, because obviously something I haven't touched on, unfortunately, sorry about that, is that the trees are a different layer, the ground is a different layer, the moose is a different layer. So I put that hue and saturation layer above everything. I figure out, okay, actually this looks good right now. The lighting, or sorry, the colors are a little more saturated. There's more contrast. And then what I do is I duplicate it and I clip the layer. It's called the clipping mask. So what you do is you put the hue and saturation. What I did is I put the hue and saturation layer over top of the layer that I wanted to clip to. I hover between the two layers, the hue and saturation above and then the layer below. I hold Alt and a little icon. Your mouse turns into a little icon that says, it links it, so it clips it to the top layer to the bottom layer, and then that way the hue and saturation layer only affects that one layer. And the reason I duplicate it a bunch of times is because if I were to just keep it on top, and I've done this before, and what I have to do is I have to paint on top of that hue and saturation layer, because the colors below it I can't sample, and if I choose a color from the palette, it'll look different because the hue and saturation layer is affecting everything below it. So what I have found that works well is I just I duplicate it to the layers below it, and then I flatten each individual layer, making sure that they're all separate, and then I can keep painting because they're all using the exact same parameters as I've changed it. Here I am. I'm using this. I'm using the Lasso Tool again, and I've define some of those cattails, those plants in the foreground there. I've hidden these rocks in the front, and I think I keep them hidden for a while because at this point I was like, well, maybe I don't need this rock in the middle. The initial idea for this painting was that, as you saw, I gave them a bunch of thumbnails initially, and some of them were third person, some of them were first person, because our game is a first person game. But third person also works for defining scale, right? If you have a human in the shot, it actually does a relatively good job getting the sense of like, oh, this moose is is big relative to this human. But it's not. But doing a third-person shot as well is also not in the spirit of the game because again, it's a first person. So in this shot, I think the reason I have the trees on the left there and the rocks that I hid in the foreground with the cattails is because it's almost like the player is looking at this moose almost from a hidden vantage point. And the idea was that the moose has become aware of you. Like I don't. That was my idea. I don't know if it ever comes across that way to everybody, but the moose is aware that something is close by, so it's beginning to turn its head over to your direction. So there is a sense of before this event that I'm painting, and then a sense of like what's going to happen after the painting. Here I am laying in the sun. At this point, I've figured out what I want to do with the lighting exactly. Like I had some reference up, and initially I was going to do I think my initial idea was to do a cloudy sky, but it was too muted, it was too flat, and I think I went to pick up my wife from work, and it was a sunset here, and we live in a nice area where the top of the trees, there's very tall trees in our area, and the top of the trees get hit last, obviously, from the setting sun, but it actually creates this nice effect where the top of the trees almost has a blown out flat lighting, and I wanted to try to capture that. And then what I did here is I used to get the sun to bleed through the trees. Is I have different layers of trees that I'm using, so I put a color dodge layer and I painted with an orange, and I kind of, you can see what I'm doing there. I put it in, and then I put another color dodge layer behind all the trees, and I got that one, I think, more subtle. And then I think with this one, I'm trying to get that sense of the sun bleeding, poking through the trees, and kind of softening the light as you go, to get a sense of space from the trees, to get a sense that the trees, there's a volume that each that the trees back there represent, and some of them are further back and some of them are forward. And here I am doing the same thing with the ice. I'm trying to get that sense of the lighting sweeping through and bouncing into different areas. Here I have I cut out a portion of this painting that was not useful. What I did is the back legs of the moose, I changed them. Initially, I think I reversed them. The two legs that are closest to the viewer are both straight down, and then the two back legs are kind of bent. And I think at some point I was like, okay, well, maybe it would look better if I flipped them, and I flipped them, and I spent some time with them, and it's like it did not look good. So I reversed that. I didn't end up doing that. So I cut it out of this particular, because it doesn't add anything. But it is important, I think, that you follow those instincts, even if they are wrong. There has been instances in the past where you do a painting, and just from time, or maybe you don't get the idea right away, those ideas stay in your mind. You never actually achieve them, and I've gotten a sense that, oh, well, maybe the painting could have been better if I had done that. Sometimes that is the case. Sometimes it's not, but it's important to explore that avenue, because I think otherwise, at least for me, it kind of starts driving me crazy. It's like, oh, what if I had flipped the legs? And it's like, well, it turns out that the flipping the legs was not a good idea, or it didn't look good. So I'm glad I followed it. I did it, and it didn't work out. Because now I know, and I can move on with the painting. So here I am spending more time with the head of the moose. I've reworked the eye. This one, it looks really angry, and moose don't really look angry. They're very dangerous animals. They look deceptively passive, and they generally are. I think, like most wildlife, they want to stay away from anything that could hurt them, even if they can hurt the thing that they're trying to stay away from, because it's dangerous to engage with anything in the wild. And I think I didn't at some point I was like, I don't like that angry eye. It's not angry. It's living its life. It's not aware of you just yet. It's beginning to become aware of the viewer, but it's not it's not walking around with being angry at the environment that it's in. You can see here that the initial couple minutes ago, I put that hue and saturation layer and kind of brought up the saturation and changed the hue of the colors ever so slightly, so it's more, the antlers are more red now than yellow. I think over time I'll change that slightly back, because they will be getting hit by the sun eventually, slightly, just to highlight them more. And here's that concept, or that idea that I was mentioning before, where I have the antlers already painted in, but I go over it with the Lasso Tool again, and I put that texture brush on it. And I'm aware of where the edge should be, so I'm trying to get that the underside of the antlers to read as a curvature, and the different edges are. I'm aware of each edge. I think in that case I probably covered it up, but for that top part of the antler, you can see that there's the dark part is actually ever so slightly on the beyond the light part, but that's fine. I think it gives it a little bit of a charm to it. Here again, I'm working on the moose again. It took me a while to get this face. I don't know exactly why. I'm not, I did a couple of studies. I think two of them before I started this, just to kind of get a sense of the moose, because I hadn't drawn it in a while. I did the concept quite some time ago. I did a little line drawing in my journal, and then like a quick, very, very, very quick painting to try to play with the brushes that I was going to use, and figure out the face. It was a photo study, I believe, and I encourage people to do that as well if you have the ability to do that. Sometimes time does not permit that, but especially if you're working on something that you're not used to drawing, you should do that. You should do a study of it. At this point, I took a break from the painting, and I noticed that area above the moose was not. It was distracting. There was too much. It was the whiteness of the background is needed for the time of day it is. That is the way the game kind of looks like when it's during the day, that the clouds are in close to the horizon. But it was too distracting in relation to the moose, and we have plenty of mountains in the game that you can always see in the distance. And I thought this is it's actually a perfect spot to put a mountain. So I blocked it in again with that circle brush. I'm not using a texture brush in this case. I'm just blocking it in. I'm softening edges with the smudge tool as well. And I just block in. I have the reference at the bottom there, bottom left. It's a screenshot from the game. I'm not copying that mountain exactly. I'm just trying to get the sense of what the mountain looks like. Because I don't want to give a sense that, especially to any fans that know the game very well, I don't want to give a sense that like, oh, this is this is exactly where you could find it. Because the more you play the game, the more if you see a mountain in the distance, it's like, oh, I know exactly where that is, because the mountains are visual points that indicate where you are. Not every single environment has the exact same mountain in the distance. They're all slightly different because you're in a different geographically and different spot in relation to each mountain. So I didn't want to. This is the one below is from I think Pleasant Valley, I believe. I didn't want to get a sense that it was in the Pleasant Valley area, because this is more of an impression of, you want to give a sense of what I wanted to give a sense to the viewer what it would be like to come across this moose, but I don't want to indicate to any fans that, oh, this is where you find it in relation to this mountain. So it's just more of the background, and the mountain is just a background object. I don't want to make it the center of attention, right? One of the reasons I block it out with the round brush is to keep the edges simple. I was zoomed out, as you can see. I'm beginning to work on these trees here, which you can see are very pixelated because I initially put them in, cut out from the screenshot of the game. So this one will take these to cover these up. It's not trivial, but it's not a big deal either. I need to be careful what I'm doing to make sure that none of it looks synthetic back there. And the trees also don't take away from the moose in the foreground, the focal point of the foreground. I want them to look like trees, but I don't want them to look like very sharp, in focus trees. They're a background element. They're helping focus the viewer towards the focal point, being specifically the face and head of the moose. Something I heard, I think Nathan Folks say once that really stuck with me is that sometimes you need to sacrifice. And by the way, this is not a direct quote. I can't remember. I can't remember exactly what he said, but the sentiment is true. This may not be accurate of what he said, but the sentiment is correct, which is the elements of the painting should work to reinforce the focal point, and even if they are sacrificed. So obviously I could paint those trees, I could spend my time and paint those trees exactly correct, and to give a sense of, oh, you can see the individual branches, the form of them incredibly well, but they would detract from the focal point. And what you want to do is you want to sacrifice that so that it focuses the viewer on where you want to focus them. And that goes for everything, not just things in the background, but even things in the foreground. And people, you do this. I think a lot of artists do this maybe without realizing exactly what they're doing, because you don't put a lot of detail in, like I mentioned before, you don't put detail in areas that you're not really looking at. That's sacrificing. If you really wanted to get, if the goal is to get a painting that is photographic, a photograph captures all the detail evenly. A painter edits out the unnecessary. So at this point, I've reworked the eye. I think what I did is at some point I took a break and I had to, okay, something's not working here, and I think I forgot to just press record at that moment when I was painting the eye, and then I noticed after I was done, I was like, oh, I didn't record that part of it. But it's it's the same as every other part of the painting. Sometimes you just have to stick with one specific area, or you have to focus your attention on that one area with again with a lot of reference, and get it right. And I think it was driving me crazy not being able to get this eye quite right, because I wanted to look from afar, like right now I think it's working from afar. The eye is there, you can tell. But I think before what was happening, it was too blue, and it was too circular, and it just looked like a dot from the distance, so that was not working. What am I here? I think I'm moving the tree line because I want it to be higher. I think that there was it was too low. Like I wanted the trees to look bigger, so I'm smudging and painting the line that of that layer out. And again, I'm continuing to work on these background trees. Some of those trees are, especially the birch trees on the left there, are done with a couple brush strokes of one of the texture brushes, or not texture brushes. The brush has a bunch of dots on it, and that's not what birch trees look like in the game. They're much sharper. But again, coming back to what I was saying before, where I'm sacrificing part of it so it doesn't detract. I'm sacrificing a part of the painting in its detail to focus the attention more on the focal point. Ideally, when you look at the painting, nobody ever is going to look at those trees and be like, "Oh, those don't look like birch trees; they look like brush strokes." Like ideally, that's the goal there, and I think it's up to the viewer to decide if I've been successful. I hope I've been. I sent this out to the art director and the creative director over time, and nothing came back as, oh, those look like what's going on back there, right? That's you do that. I do that to save time a little bit, but mostly to give a painterly look to it. That was the reason to do it. If I was doing a painting that was more photorealistic, I might have used a photo back there and maybe smudged it a little bit, but it would have been accurate to what the representation of those trees would have been in general. Here I am working on the face of the moose again and giving it lighting. I wanted to, as you can see too, if you look at the layer over top of the moose one that's highlighted there, that's a clipping mask. So same principle. I used a masking with the Lasso Tool, but also another way, once you have a good edge, is you just clip a layer over top of it with the clipping mask, and then paint over top of it without doing a selection, because your edges will be respected since it's referencing the layer below to determine its edge. And I think the reason I have it separate is because I don't know if this is going to work. I don't end up keeping this exact lighting on the head. It's too distracting. One of the things I do as well is you see I did it with the mountain as well, but I have the yellowish light hitting the moose, but on the edge I put more of an orange. If you do studies of real life painting is the best. If you can get out and actually look at what lighting is doing and try to capture it with either a digital canvas or a traditional canvas, you notice that the way the light scatters isn't just a direct. The edges has a soft fall off in some areas, but it also, the color changes according to the edge. You can really see this if you have a flashlight and you put it on your hand, and you hold it up to your hand you can see the edge where the light is scattering in your flesh, and it's more red. But if you put the light maybe on your knee or on an area that has more bone close to it, there's less of that. The light is scattering differently because it's maybe close to the surface. It's just not. The point being is that it gives I'm adding color to the light. It's not just one color. Depending on what the lighting is, you can add different ones. And sunset one, I have found that the edge of where the light is transitioning from light to dark, you can get more saturation there. One of the things I remember learning was that depending on the type of painting you're doing, lighting can actually be unsaturated. The lightest part can be very unsaturated in relation to what the shadow could be far more saturated. And I remember when I first saw that, I remember taking color samples in Photoshop, and I was like, oh, it's true. Like you don't realize it for whatever reason. Like you think that the lighting area should be the most colorful. It depends. Sometimes it is, depending on the painting. It depends how you're treating the exposure of the painting. But sometimes it's not. In this case, there's less saturation in the lightest part than there is in maybe the darkest part. Like I think the saturation of the darkest shadow of the painting, or the dark, like this foreground rock, is probably far greater than it is in the lightest area, especially right behind the moose there, where I've given an impression, hopefully, of the field behind the moose that's getting hit. That's more light on it. It's closer to white, but it's actually less saturated. There's less color in relation to what the shadow is. And here at this point, the painting is I think I'm feeling okay. It's working. Like the lighting is there, the major elements in there. I'm starting to zoom in and work on some detail. And there's a lot of undos here. There's a lot of Control Z's or Command Z's. Because I'm doing it with brush, like I'm actually using a brush. I'm not doing a selection for some of the blades of grass or some things. For the cattails, I do, but I do soften the edges eventually. At this point, I'm letting the brush strokes do some of the work for me. But it takes practice, and it takes sometimes just time to get that right brush stroke. One of the beautiful things with Photoshop is that you can undo. So I do a brush stroke, oh, it's not quite right, I undo it, and then I do another one. You can't get carried away. There's been times where I'm like struggling to get that right mark, and I'm so busy Control Zing that I actually Control Z of the one I like. So I'm more I'm more in a mode of like Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. And I end up undoing the one I like. And at this stage, I am in the detail stage of this painting. I've moved into the final stages here. At this point, I'm adding this texture of brushstrokes to the painting with an overlay layer. And I learned this from Jay Park. He does this a lot with his painting. It's a really nice look to it. And I reduce it a lot. I try to be very subtle with it to kind of give a sense that there's brushstrokes there, just to give an impression of more painterly look. And I took a break from the painting for about 24 hours maybe, and I came back with it with fresh eyes, and I noticed minor things with the face. I changed the snout a little bit more, but really minor things. At this point, the painting was done. I sent it off for approval. It achieved the approval, which was great, and the painting is complete. So thanks for watching, and go play the long dark.